with recording. If anyone doesn't is not okay with it, do let me know. So I'm not sure whether I'm recording not.
You are. I see a red dot in the left. Top left.
Okay, very good. So it's my very great pleasure to welcome Arnold Brooks for another of our series of the Marquette University Midwest Seminar in Ancient and Medieval Philosophy. We've been doing this for quite a number of years now. Sometimes we have funding to bring people or to take them out to dinner. Some years we don't. One of the silver linings of COVID is that this kind of opportunity to share work in progress with our colleagues and fellow scholars is possible now without travel, and we can bring in a much wider audience. And so I'm very happy that we've been able to line up Arnold Brooks to speak on Aristotle's physics. Arnold is a graduate student at the University of Chicago. He is writing a dissertation on the physics with, I believe, Gabrielle Lear, and he has written and published a paper called A Fault Line in Aristotle's Physics that was published in Ancient Philosophy last year. I haven't had a chance to read it, but as I was looking over book 6 of the physics again today, I was telling myself, this is one of these books that has never made sense to me. I just don't understand some of the basic moves that Aristotle is doing here. And then I looked at his article in Ancient Philosophy, and the article, in fact, is about how these chapters have not made very much sense to a lot of people. So I look forward to a chance to read that article in the future. Maybe some of these same themes will arise today. And I hope that maybe we'll be able to understand what's going on in Physics 6 a little bit better. So Arnold will be reading a paper for about 45 minutes, and then we will be opening things up to discussion. You should be seeing a PowerPoint on the main screen, and you should be seeing Arnold down below. I will ask everybody to make sure that your microphone is muted, otherwise some distracting noises will probably come up. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Arnold Brooks.
So thank you very much, Owen, for having me here, and thank you all for coming. I appreciate the honor that I'm being shown in getting a chance to talk to you today. So as Owen mentioned, Physics 6 is it's a real terra incognita, both from the perspective of ancient and modern commentary. And some of the interpretive difficulties that have sort of plagued the book have Simplicius cites Theophrastus getting vexed about some of these issues, and at which point you might just wonder why he didn't ask Aristotle. But these things do tend to start exploding once you get lots of interpretations on the table. So my project today is in some ways a kind of ambitious one, and I hope you'll bear with me. I've got quite a lot to get through, and I'm going to try to move fairly quickly. The project essentially is to give you an overview of the main argument of Physics 6. So when I say that it's a terra incognita, what I mean is that what we can do with Physics 1, Physics Book 1, is say, what's it about? Okay, it's about the principles of nature or change. And what's the view that Aristotle wants to defend? It's that there are 3 such principles: form, substratum, and privation, and that these are related in some way to form and matter. And that's the view, right? And then when we get to Book 2, we can say something like, okay, so what's this book about? It's about causality. And what's the view to be defended? Well, we have the tetracausal system, and we have the idea that, in particular, that final cause is the way to make sense of the universe as a whole, and as opposed to chance and necessity, right? That we can give a sort of one sentence précis of the book when we do that, right? And we can't do that for physics 6. And so my goal today is basically to give such a little summary of physics 6 and then explain why this is correct. So my summary basically is as follows. Physics 6 is written to answer the question, why are those continuous aspects of nature continuous? And by continuous, I mean something like infinitely divisible into divisibles, right? So a magnitude is continuous when you can only cut it further into divisible magnitudes. And Aristotle, like many after him, including Kant, as I'm about to mention, thought that space or place, time, change, bodies, all of these things are all continuous. And the question is, why? What makes them continuous? Where is that? What's the basis for this structural feature that's common to everything in nature? And just to give some sense of the interest of the topic, for me, it sounds quite dry, but and I hope you can relate to this anecdote. I recognize that it sounds a little crazy, but at the end of a long walk, I sometimes get quite frustrated with the fact that there exists a natural world full of magnitudes. These magnitudes can't be crossed immediately the way I can do it in my mind. You know, when I'm doing geometry, I go from one end of a square to the other instantaneously. These magnitudes must be endured fraction by fraction by fraction by fraction. If I'm to get all the way home, I have to go the next, you know, the whole rest of the mile. And it's you know, oddly enough, a little frustrating that the natural world exists and that it has this structure sometimes. In contrast to the unlimited power of my thought, or so it seems to me, in traversing a magnitude. And so in some sense, the question is just, excuse me, the question is just, what is it that makes nature like this? That is, why does it have this common topological structure? And this isn't just Aristotle's question, it's also Kant's question. So just to situate the question a little bit, in Kant's inaugural dissertation, he tried to give an a priori account of what he called the law of continuity, or what Leibniz called the law of continuity, and what Kant wanted to justify on a priori grounds. And Kant's explanation, right, essentially Kant's explanation for why changes are continuous was that changes are continuous because time is continuous, and time is primitively continuous. So in the first quote we have here, he's explaining that time is primitively continuous, and he thinks it's primitively continuous because he says, since by time there are only thought relations without any mutually related data, there is in time as a quantity composition, which being conceived wholly removed leaves nothing over. In other words, temporal relations thought apart from the quantitative relation between them, between say two times, is all there is to time, right? There is nothing to time except that kind of difference. And so there is no smallest conceivable difference. Nothing could place a constraint on the smallest possible time. And so Kant thinks time is continuous, just as primitively. That is, we don't need to appeal to the divisibility or continuity of anything else in order to explain the continuity of time. But the continuity of change does require some explanation. And Kant's explanation is that since there's no smallest time, between any two moments, we should be able to identify yet a third moment of time, and therefore yet a third stage in a change, right? So if you imagine something bleaching out in the sun, and it's going from dark to light. Halfway through the change, or halfway through any minute part of the change that you'd like to isolate, you'll be able to find an intermediate shade, right, through which the thing is changing. And so Kant thinks he can explain the continuity of changes just by referring to the continuity of time. This is a slightly sketchy explanation on his part, and I'm going to return to Kant later, just to show how he tries to flesh it out in the first critique. But the point is, Kant needs to explain the continuity of changes in terms of something else, and he does so by referring to the continuity of time. And I've just drawn a little diagram here. You have states on the left and times on the bottom, and each state is associated with a time. And of course, we can find an intermediate between these. By the way, can you all see my pointer?
Yes.
Okay, good. We can find an intermediate time and therefore an intermediate state, Kant thinks, and that's how we can show that the change is continuous, because there's a continuum of states on the left side here, just as there's a continuum of moments and times on the bottom. But Kant assumes that for every moment in time, there's a unique state. He doesn't have any, I think, way to show this in the inaugural dissertation. And I think he comes to recognize the inadequacy of this explanation by the time he writes the first critique, in a way that's interestingly related to Aristotle's approach. So the main argument of physics 6, which I think takes place in physics 6.4 through 6, so these central 3 chapters, is surrounds what I'm going to call the aspects of change. And the aspects of change are 5 kinds of things that Aristotle identifies, all of which are mutually divisible. And we're going to look at the argument that says that they're mutually divisible in a minute, but right now I just want to get this list in front of us. And this is a 5-way isomorphism. These things all have the same structure as magnitudes. And this is, I think, one of the strangest things about physics 6 is the fact that it treats, that it sees so many aspects in change. I think a modern person is inclined to say something like, well, you have the time and then you have the distance. Those are the 2 magnitudes associated with the change, and there's nothing else. Aristotle wants to talk about the change in addition to that, right? So the color or temperature or place or size, that in which something changes, is down here, and the time of the change is here, but independent of that is the change, one of the things that he lists in 6.4 as an aspect of change. In addition to that, though, we have the changing thing, which is, as a body, also divisible. And we have the changing undergone by the changing thing. And this is certainly the strangest and most novel element of the account of change in physics 6, is that Aristotle distinguishes, I think here alone, nowhere else in the corpus, here alone, he distinguishes between change and changing. And we're going to talk about what's special about changing as opposed to change in a minute. Just a little note, throughout physics 6, Aristotle flip-flops between using kinesis and metabole to refer to change or motion. There doesn't appear to me to be any order to this, though he does distinguish he does treat these 2 words technically in the previous book. In book 5, he says that metabole includes all changes, while kinesis are only changes in place, quality, or size, quantity. But I think in physics 6, there's no attention paid to that distinction, and he just switches willy-nilly. So keep that in mind. Okay, so these are the aspects of change, and much of the argument is going to center on showing how these things are related. Okay, so with that preliminary, I want to now just get into the question of how these chapters are structured and how I identified this as, how I want to identify this as as it were, a continuous argument, 6.4 through 6, and as the central argument of physics 6. So the basis of this is a signpost that comes at the end of 6.4, where Aristotle says, in the same way it will be shown also that length is divisible, and generally everything in which a change is, though some only accidentally because the changing thing is divisible. For the division of one will divide all. Also as regards their being finite or infinite, all will be similarly disposed. And the divisibility of all things, especially, and also the infinity, follows from the changing thing. For divisibility and infinity belong primitively to the changing thing. That divisibility does so, we have shown before. That infinity does so will be made clear in what follows. So right away, I can essentially now give you the summary of physics 6, of this main argument in physics 6, which is, why is everything in nature have this common structure, that of continuity? And the answer is because the changing thing is continuous. That's the basis. That's the explanation for the continuity of everything else. Of course, this, in some sense, doesn't come as a surprise. Aristotle is famously focused on substance as the basis for the features of nature, and resistant to sort of Platonizing attempts to understand various features of nature in terms of things like space or something like that. But it may come as a little surprising because I think, and maybe we can talk about this in the Q&A, this is a revision to Aristotle's original theory. That is, that Aristotle's original theory, which is given in Physics 4, is different than this. And there he says that what we might call spatial magnitudes are the basis for the continuity of everything else. So one thing I want to note about this signpost, though, is this phrase, for the divisibility and infinity belong primitively to the changing thing. In Greek, euthus gar en huparche, to metabalanti, to diairaton kai, to peron, mirrors very closely the language at the end of Physics 6.6. And so that's how I'm identifying the sort of boundaries of this argument. Here too, he says, for something infinite belongs primitively to what becomes and to what perishes. Euthus gar en huparche, that's exactly the same as the 6.4 signpost. To gignomeno kai to there romeno aperonti, right? So I take this to signal the closure of the argument announced in 6.4. And if we go back up to 6.4, we can see that Aristotle places this signpost in the middle of the argument, right? Some of this argument has already been achieved and some of it still remains. And so I have a diagram here. These are these three chapters, 6.4, 6.5, and 6.6. And the signpost is the pink squares of the two signposts, which Aristotle lists that every aspect of change is divisible and mutually divisible, that the changing thing is primitively divisible, that every aspect of change is infinite, and that the changing thing is primitively infinite. And I've identified the location of these the arguments for these theses on this little chart here. So 1 and 2 are argued already by the time we get the signpost, and somewhere between the two signposts, Aristotle argues for 3 and 4. I don't think I understand exactly where he argues for 3. It may just be a sort of a fortiori implication of what he's already established, but 4 essentially gets announced at the end of 6.6. So the overarching argument, I think, of the entire set of 3 chapters is something like this. If A and B are aspects of change, and both are divisible or infinite, and A is divisible or infinite primitively, and B is divisible or infinite non-primitively, that is only by appealing to the infinity or divisibility of something else, then A explains the divisibility or infinity of B. And that's the central inference. That inference is not well expressed in the text, but I take that to be the way that Aristotle gets from what he does argue to the announced conclusion, namely that the divisibility and infinity of every other aspect of change follows from the divisibility and infinity of the changing thing. Just another note on the word infinity. Aristotle doesn't clearly mark this in these chapters. In Physics 6.2, he says that there are two senses of infinite, infinite by extension and infinite by divisibility. And he seems to be using infinite as infinite by divisibility throughout. Though he does endorse both claims, that is, that if one of these aspects is infinite in either sense, all the others must be infinite in either sense. That is, if there's any change that is infinite in time, it must also be infinite in extent, and so on, and involve an infinitely large body and all of those things. Of course, he thinks that infinite changes by extent are impossible, but he does argue in Physics 6.7 that this will all follow for extensive infinity too. Okay, so now I'm just going to go through these three chapters one by one and try to show how he gets through these four theses. So I'll start with 6.4. And I divide 6.4 into two arguments. Each of these arguments, in the second argument, 234b21 through 235a34, involves many stages. One of the most remarkable things about Physics 6 is it's one of the most complicated bits of argumentation I've found in the corpus. Whereby complicated, I don't just mean difficult to understand or anything like that. It's that the parts, there are very, very many parts, and they all fit together into quite a large whole. That is this three-chapter argument. And that's a little bit unusual for Aristotle, I think, to argue like that, and to some extent a slightly nonlinear way. So this middle argument, which I'm going to talk about first, where is supposed to show that if any one aspect of change is assumed to be divisible, then any other can be shown to be divisible. And I think this is quite a natural and intuitive point. That is, if I have a walk, I can divide the time of my walk, say, in half, and as long as I'm moving through, that will also be the distance that I travel. And Aristotle gives a sort of proof of this, where he says that, which I've sort of schematized here, where A and B are elements from among the aspects of a change, that is, times, changes, bodies, distances, changings, etc. If we divide A into A prime and A double prime, then A prime will correspond to some B prime, A double prime will correspond to some B double prime. The two B's will together constitute a whole B, and A will correspond to B. And therefore, if A is divisible, B will be divisible according to the same division. So here's what I mean. Take a whole change, AC divided at B, and we take the time of that, and we divide it in half at B into AB and BC. If we then look for the time of the first half, AB, we'll get this time. And if we look for the time of the second half of the change, we'll get this time. These two times, DE and EF, will together constitute one whole time DF that will in turn constitute the time of the whole change AC, right? And Aristotle aims to show by this argument that any division in the change will produce as it were, a corresponding division in the time, right? So he sort of constructs the time out of the parts that he associates with the parts of the change. I think that this argument is a little problematic in various ways. In particular, the thesis that the two parts of the time will constitute a whole time, a whole continuous time, is, I think, probably question begging, but nevertheless, it's the way Aristotle wants to proceed. And Aristotle extends this method of proof to every aspect of change. And to some extent, in doing so, he does something quite remarkable. And that comes in the first part of the longer argument that I'm discussing now. He relates the changing thing and the change, right? So he says, if you take the first part of the body of the changing thing, that will be associated with a change dE, and the second part of the changing thing will be associated with a change EF, and that together these two parts, these two changes, will constitute the change of the whole thing. The remarkable implication being that the change is propagating through the body of the changing thing. Aristotle seems to assume throughout Physics 6, or throughout this argument, that that's the way change goes, and in fact that that's the way all changes go. They all propagate through the body of the changing thing, such that whenever you divide a change, you also divide the changing thing into the part that is already changed and the part that is not yet changed. And I'm happy to talk more about this conception of change. There are all sorts of questions one can raise about it. And so in the Q&A, to cover what I don't cover here, I have lots to say about it, but I can't dwell on it and explain, say, how generation is supposed to work on this model. But I can do that later. Okay, so we have our, from this argument, we have our 5 aspects of change. And Aristotle has hoped to show that from the divisibility of any one aspect, we can show that any other is divisible. And so we've got this little network of mutually divisible objects. But we're, as it were, stuck because we can't show that one of them is divisible primitively, right? This is exactly what Kant wanted to do by talking about time as an intuition, as a sort of pure intuition, nothing but temporal relation. And Aristotle, as it were, needs a version of that. Aristotle, of course, cannot show that time is primitively divisible. Time is a derivative part of nature for him. He's a reductivist about time in that he thinks it's merely the sort of quantitative aspect of change. And so Aristotle's approach is instead to show that the changing thing itself. He does this in the opening argument. This is one of those arguments that Bostock trashes in his commentary. His otherwise, well, sorry, I mean, this too is excellent, but his excellent commentary on Physics 6, he thinks that this argument is a complete heap of trash. But I think it's quite solid from an Aristotelian point of view. So the argument is essentially this. When something is changing, it's in that from which it was changing, or that to which it was changing, or neither or both, right? So we're talking about what is going on with the thing, the changing thing, when it's changing, right? And Aristotle says it can't be in that to which it's changing, because then the change would be over. It can't be in that from which it's changing, because then the change has not yet begun. It can't be in neither, because, and here he asks us to assume that the change is a change to its first result. This is the thing that Bostock really doesn't like. And therefore, it can only be, and therefore it has to be in both, that from which and that to which it changes. But since they're, as it were, competing qualities or places or whatever, it can only do so if it's partly in the one and partly in the other. So to illustrate, we've got a block changing from white to blue. At T0, the block is not changing because it's entirely white. T0 might be, say, the last moment before it starts changing. At T2, the thing is no longer changing. It's entirely blue now. It's finished changing. Now we would say that it has changed. And so between T0 and T2, the changing thing must be partly white and partly blue. And so if we interrupt the change, say at T1, we'll get a half blue, half white block. And therefore, a fortiori, it must have parts. Right? So that's the argument by which Aristotle wants to show that changing things are divisible. And the thing that's important about this argument is that it does not appeal, unlike every other argument in 6.4, to the divisibility of something else. When Aristotle wanted to show that time was divisible according to change or change according to time, he would have to refer to the other aspect in order to show that. This is the one case where Aristotle does not appeal to another aspect of change in arguing that something is divisible. And that's what makes this argument special. And that's what allows it to, by Aristotle's lights, establish the primitive divisibility of the changing thing, right? So we can, as it were, break into this network of mutually divisible aspects of change at the point of the changing thing. That's the thing that's going to explain the continuity of everything else. So the implicit argument here, as I mentioned, is, because Aristotle doesn't state this, but this is what I think is going on, is that if a changing thing can be shown to be divisible without referring to the divisibility of anything else, but the divisibility of everything else can only be shown by appealing to the divisibility of another thing, then the divisibility of the changing thing explains the divisibility of everything else. That's what allows it to be that from which follows the divisibility of other things. Now, this argument only concerns divisibility. Aristotle has divided this argument into two parts. And this part, the green part, just concerns the divisibility of the aspects of change. He has not yet approached the question of as it were, the infinity of them. And he divides them in this way, I'm not sure why he divides them in this way, but I think he probably divides them in this way because for him, to show that something is continuous is to show that it is both divisible and homogeneous. And this is a tradition in the thinking about continuity that goes back probably all the way back to Parmenides at least. And that's why the second argument, that is 6.5 and 6.6, goes the way it does, because he needs to show that these things are divisible in one stage and then separately show that they're infinite in a separate stage. So I'm just going to briefly touch on 6.5. 6.5 is maybe the most famous part of this stretch of text because Aristotle includes the remarkable claim that there is no such thing as the beginning of a change. This is something Theophrastus apparently called an amazing claim. And Theophrastus's Physics 1 is all about this stuff. So he was very invested in this particular set of ideas. 6.5 is essentially an essay on having changed, on this sort of perfect aspect verb used in relation to change. And the aim of the chapter is to explain what having changed means in relation to these other aspects of change. So when I say the block has changed, what am I pointing to in the time of the change, in which the thing is changing? What am I pointing to in the body of the changing thing? And Aristotle proceeds by distinguishing having changed into two senses. That something has changed in the sense that it's completed a change. And we say it's like, it now has become blue. Or when something is just beginning to change. And this is the sense Ben Morrison puts this well when he describes this as when you say, has the train pulled out of the station? Or has the train moved? Right, when you're sitting on a train, when you mean something like has it, as it were, started going. And Aristotle's wants to show about the former sense, that is, having completed a change, that this corresponds to the end of a change in time, that is its final moment. And in addition, it corresponds to the whole changing thing, having changed, into its new state, right? And then he wants to argue that the other sense of having changed, that is, having begun to change, corresponds to nothing. There is no time at which something has begun to change. That's a fiction. There is, as he says, no such thing as the beginning of a change. Aristotle's aim here, I think, is a preparation for the next chapter, in which he wants to talk about the continuous aspect verb, changing. And what he wants to prepare us for is the idea that you cannot construct a change out of having changed, right? So you can't take a change and break it down into moments in which it has completed a change and little moments in which it has begun to change, right? That the time when something has changed has to be, as it were, only the limit of something's changing. This relates to a discussion in 6.1 in which he argues that changing can't happen by or nothing can have changed without having previously been changing. And so that brings us to the last chapter here, 6.6. 6.6 consists mostly of a long argument concerning changing, and then the second signpost, which we've already looked at. And the main machine of this argument is a discussion of the idea of a primary time. This is a style of argument that Aristotle has developed for this chapter, where he argues that that something has a primary x time or distance or something like that, when or a primary x is some element belonging to an aspect of change that is simplest. That is, it's the element from which any larger thing would be composed. And Aristotle aims to show that there is no primary element of an aspect of change for any aspect of change corresponding to the changing of a changing thing. So here's what I mean by this. If we take a walk, so say I went for a walk yesterday from 5:30 to 6. We can say that I went for a walk yesterday, and we can say I went for a walk in 2021, right? But those are all count as the times of my walk, but they're not the primary time of my walk, because they only are what they are because there's a part of them that is the proper time of my walk, the primary time. And the primary time of my walk is 5:30 to 6, right, on a given Sunday in January. That is, it's primary because there's no smaller thing that we could pick out to be the time of my walk. And every change has, in this sense, a primary time. That is the smallest possible time that you could locate this change within. And what Aristotle wants to show here is that the changing of a changing thing, conceived of as distinct from the change, does not have a primary time. And so you can think of that whenever you use the continuous aspect verb. You can say, so an easy case would be something like, I'm sitting right now. I've been sitting since the beginning of this talk. I've been sitting in every part of this talk. There is no time at which, there's no smallest time that you could identify as the time of my sitting. If you were to say, find me the simplest, smallest element in which Arnold was sitting, you wouldn't be able to do it, right? Because any time in which I'm sitting is divisible into a first part in which I'm still sitting and a second part in which I'm also sitting. And so that's the way that Aristotle wants to show that something doesn't have a primary time. And he thinks that that's true of changing, right? So when our block from above is changing from white to blue, it's changing from white to blue in the beginning of the change, or in the first half of the change. It's changing from white to blue in the second half. It's changing from white to blue in any part of the change you'd like to select. It's the change from white to blue takes up the entire time. That's the smallest time that it can take up. But its changing takes up, it doesn't have a primary or simplest time. And changing is unique in this sense, right? So if you take a given change, AC, that there's a unique time that belongs to that change, primary time. There's a unique thing that has changed. There's a unique amount of distance covered or size gained or lost in that change, if it's a change of quantity in that way, or place. And if we take any part of that whole change, then we'll have to find a new unique time, a new unique thing, and a new unique distance or size, if relevant, to correspond to that change. They all of these aspects of change, that is all four other than changing, share a common structural feature. We would think of as something that is, the first part is different from the second part, each part is different from the whole. Any part of a change describes a distinct change. One can think of Aristotle's discussion of building a temple near the end of Nicomachean Ethics, where he describes each part of that process as a little distinct change that has to be gone through, as opposed to pleasure, which doesn't work this way. But changing is, of all of these aspects of change, unique in that it does not have linear order. The changing of a changing thing is the same in the first half of the change and in the second. Um, and that is what makes it homogeneous, right? So by homogeneous, I just mean that every part has the same characterization as the whole, and the same characterization as any other part. So just to go back to Kant for a moment, but when he wrote the Critique of Pure Reason, he'd revised his strategy for demonstrating the law of continuity on a priori grounds. I think he just saw that the argument on the basis of time, the structure of time alone, was just question begging. Or maybe he just found this more appealing. In the Critique of Pure Reason, in the second analogy, he wants to say that every alteration is grounded in a causal rule, and so we have to see it as caused by something. And so, for example, or to read what he says here, every alteration has a cause which manifests its causality in the entire time during which the alteration proceeds. Thus, this cause does not produce its alteration suddenly, but rather in a time, so that as the time increases from the initial instant A to its completion B, where A and B refer to the states in the change, at the termini of the change, the magnitude of the reality, B minus A, right, so the difference between them, is also generated through all the smaller degrees that are contained between the first and the last. All alteration is therefore possible only through a continuous action of causality, which insofar as it is uniform is called a moment. So Kant's new approach is to say that the cause of an alteration must be in action throughout the change, and that the action of this cause is temporally homogeneous. That is, whatever this cause is, which we can't know a priori, but we can, as it were, understand the formal feature of it a priori. Whatever this cause is, it's just in action throughout the change, right? But its being in action is not something that itself has temporal structure. It's not something that has linear order. It's not doing different things at different times. It's just producing this causal force in the patient. And if the cause is acting throughout the change, then there can be no period of time, right, no smallest part, that in which there was no difference in state, right? Because then the cause will have acted in that small part of the time without having accomplished anything. So where Kant's old approach wasn't going to work, because it's entirely possible that changes could proceed stepwise, right? Where you get these jumps and then periods of rest. And say if they're very small, you might not notice it or something like that. Kant has no way to rule that out. But here, he's going to try to rule that out on the grounds that during the period of rest, the causal agents will have to be in action, but not accomplishing anything. And that, he thinks, is impossible. And so he thinks as long as the causal agent is in action, then we have to be able to find some difference. And so there can't be any smallest difference. And so the change has to be continuous. And what Kant is doing is he's appealing to the homogeneity, the temporal homogeneity of the action of the agent, which is, in a sense, precisely what Aristotle does, though he places it quite differently. And this is in keeping with an ancient tradition, which we can find from Simplicius, who's in his commentary on the physics is discussing Zeno, and he reports Porphyry's report of Parmenides' argument, which I've sort of excerpted here. So Parmenides is here arguing that the universe is one indivisible being, and he wants to say it will not therefore be divided, but will remain one. For in addition, since it is in every way alike, if it is divisible, it will be divisible in all ways alike, but not here yes and there no. So the inference that Parmenides is making is that if something is divisible and it's homogeneous, then it's infinitely divisible, because there's no way that a division could be privileged in one place or another, right? And so he thinks that it'll be divided everywhere and there will be nothing left. Aristotle responds to this argument, or an argument like this, in Generation and Corruption. But Aristotle does, I think, seem to accept the connection between homogeneity and infinite divisibility. Whereas what Parmenides wants to argue here is that since it's homogeneous and infinite divisibility is paradoxical, it's got to be indivisible. So the underlying reasoning in 6.6 is that in order to show that something is continuous, that is divisible, a divisible magnitude divisible only into other divisible magnitudes, one must show that it's a magnitude, which Aristotle just takes for granted, with relation to time and change and all of these things. You have to show that it's divisible, which he argues for in 6.4, and then you have to show that it's homogeneous, or that some element of it is homogeneous. And that's what he does in 6.6 with the changing undergone by the changing thing. And the reason why that allows us to say that all of these aspects of change are infinitely divisible is because if the changing of the changing thing is homogeneous and divisible, then it's infinitely divisible, right? So that's the reasoning, the sort of Parmenidean reasoning that I've just explained. But since all aspects of change are mutually divisible, then if any one is infinitely divisible, all must be. And so once he's shown that the changing undergone by the changing thing is an infinitely divisible magnitude on the grounds that it's both divisible and homogeneous, given that you can make any division in it, and that will correspond to division in the change, the time that in which it changes, or the changing thing, you can show that all of these things are infinitely divisible. And I think from there, Aristotle wants to say, though I'm very unclear about this, he still wants to root the infinity of the aspects of change, that is their infinite divisibility, in the changing thing. But it seems like he's shown it in relation not to the changing thing, but to the changing. And I think Aristotle would say one of these two things. I don't know which. Either he would want to say, look, I've already shown you that the changing thing is the basis for all of this stuff. So it's still the basis, right? The fact that I've made this argument in terms of the changing thing doesn't put us on any different ground there. Or he would want to say that, and this is to some extent suggested by the second signpost, where he starts talking about generation and destruction, which haven't come up yet and come out of the blue a little bit. He would want to say something like this: every changing thing is itself the result of a change and is possible because it came about through a change, namely the change by which it was generated. And since that change had to be continuous, the changing thing itself must be continuous. The reason I don't like this strategy, though it does appear to be sort of attested in the text here, is that I really don't see how it roots the infinity of the aspects of change in the changing thing as opposed to the change or something else. So I'm unclear on that point, and I would appreciate any help on it. And that's it. That's the conclusion of the talk.
Thank you very much. Just as in Zoom, there is a raise your hand feature. So let's use it. And the first question is from Aldo Lerario.
All right, can you see me? Yeah, thank you. So thank you, Mr. Brooks, for your brilliant talk. And thank you, Professor Golding, for having me here. I'm a guest. I am a doctoral student at Ludwig Maximilians Universität Munich, and I'm a student of Professor Scotti, who is also here, and she is my second supervisor. So my questions will be really about understanding, because this stuff is really complex, and I am starting to study myself also change, because I need it for the study of how intellectual states come about. And their coming about is different from normal change. So all this is really useful to me. So first, maybe it's really guesswork, but picking up on the last thing you said, Mr. Brooks, I would go with the hypothesis you made that the changing thing is the basis for change. I would probably guess that Aristotle is going that way just because of how his ontology is structured. Like, I mean, take time. Time is not the primitive thing. The primitive thing is movement. So you are always basing yourself on the substrate, which is the only thing really ontologically existing. So all abstract aspects of change are like aspects of the changing thing. I realize that this is not an argument, it doesn't resolve anything, but I would guess that it's just Aristotle's viewpoint that you need to base yourself on concretely existing substances and elements to describe the processes that they undergo. But this was not part of the question. This was just a random thought that came about at the end. Now, my question was rather about the beginning and the ending of change, because I get that change is continuous in itself, and I find your reconstruction very interesting and compelling. What I don't understand at this point, and it is probably ignorance because I haven't studied the physics yet thoroughly, is beginning and ending are themselves in some way discrete. Am I right? And if change is continuous, how are the beginning and the ending of a process described by Aristotle? And connected to this, the second question would be, when describing the generation and corruption of form, Aristotle has this very interesting formula, which is repeated, I think, 3 times in the Metaphysics, or so say Frege and Patzig, which is that forms are not really generated or corrupted, but they are and are not. So at some point in the change, they take place, and it would seem they take place discretely. So how, according to you, would Aristotle describe this discrete event within the perennial, I would argue, how do you say that in English? Flux of change, within the continuous process of change. How is it that we get discrete moments in which we achieve something? Thank you. I hope I was clear, because here in Italy is quite late and I'm not thinking straight anymore.
No, thank you for your question. So I think that he I want to speak to what he says in Physics 6 without necessarily trying to incorporate that into the broader corpus in the same sentence, as it were. That is, I can talk about that afterwards. But so what he says in 6.5, which I have here, is that the complete. So this is really an essay on the beginning and end of a change, right? What it means for a change to begin or end. And his claim here is that the ending of a change is an indivisible part of time, right? So that a change ends in a moment, not in anything of any duration, sort of what we would call a limit. And he also says that there is no beginning of a change, right? So nothing ever, there is no such event as the beginning of a change. What you have is the last moment of rest, followed by some amount of changing, followed by a completion. And if you try to find a beginning there, you will either find that last moment of rest in which the thing has not yet changed at all, or you'll find another moment in which the thing has completed some change, some part of the whole change. And remarkably, and again, I say remarkably because this is something that seems to be contradicted in many other places, or a couple of other places at least, in the physics and also in the corpus. In Physics 6, he says that every changing thing undergoes infinitely many changes, and that every changing thing has changed infinitely many times. And so these points, right, which we mark as the completion of a change, are densely ordered. Between any two, I can find a third. And so anything that has undergone any kind of change has already changed infinitely many times, he says. And how that interacts with potentiality and actuality, are these actual changes, are these merely potential changes? is as it were an avenue for speculation. Remarkably enough, actuality, matter, form, causation, agent, patient, none of these concepts come up anywhere in physics 6. He never mentions them. He never puts anything in terms of them. The closest he does so is actually a remark he makes where he refers to physics 6.6 and this weird fact about the infinity of change in Metaphysics Theta 8, where he's talking about intellectual changes, that is, changes whereby people, say, learn. And he wants to assimilate that to this. And there he does talk about actuality and potentiality. I have a draft of the paper that Owen almost at one point that I can send you if you'd like. But it discusses that relation. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I think I mean I will have a lot of thinking to do about this stuff, but I would enjoy reading your paper for sure. So I don't know, maybe I will try to find your contact and write you an email or something like that.
Yeah. I can. I'm on the U Chicago website, so my email's up there.
All right, thank you. I will be writing you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure. I mean, one way to think about this idea of the no beginning but there's an end is just, it's something like there's no real number larger than 1 that's the first real number larger than 1, right? That is, you can't start counting from 1 to 2 by real numbers, right? There is no first number that you could count.
Yeah.
And Aristotle's thought is like that. That's not at all how he conceives of the continuum, but it's similarly that there's no first part of a change that you could accomplish, because there'd always be some part of that you could identify.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, I'll think about that.
Okay, Bob Powers and then Cameron.
Hey, thank you very much. Can I offer an analogy and then ask you to correct it if I'm missing it on any point, and then ask you if you would mind elaborating on the kind of reduction of the infinitely divisible continuum to the primitive that seemed to happen between Parmenides and Aristotle. Mm-hmm. And the analogy is like, so there's no beginning and there's no end to change, is like there's no beginning and there's no end to a line, in that the beginning and the end of a line in Euclidean geometry are points. And to say, well, where is the beginning and where is the end is like saying how long is the point at the beginning and how long is the point at the end. And of course, the beginning, the points have no length, right? Mm-hmm. So then what is the continuum between 2 points? It seems like there's like a confusion going on about like how many, the question almost sounds like how many points can we squeeze between 2 points? But the question's absurd because points have no length, right? So then you have to have something that's primitive, and the primitive thing is the line, mm-hmm. But the line is continuous and so infinitely divisible. So there's like the reduction of the infinitely divisible continuous to the primitive, and that's so could you elaborate on the Parmenides Aristotle thing that you talked about? I think it was in slide like 20. Right.
So he does think that there is an end of a change. That is the moment in which something, like if something's going from being white to being blue, the moment in which it's entirely blue is the termination, and it's the end of the change. And Aristotle just thinks that there's no beginning, right? So it's tempting to start talking about half-open intervals or open intervals when thinking about this. I don't think that Aristotle has the mathematical equipment to define or describe any such thing, though he does sort of allude to that sort of idea. So I worry about being anachronistic there. But yeah, the thought is like, so what any modern person would do since Dedekind in relation to the continuum is identify the continuum with the real number line, right? So we've got we can use Dedekind's procedure to basically construct the continuum out of a densely ordered set of points. Aristotle has no, Aristotle's approach wouldn't tolerate this even if he heard about it, but he certainly didn't hear about it. I mean, this is, took us a while to get to that idea. And Aristotle's thought is the only thing that you can decompose a continuum into is just other continua, right? And you can identify the outer limits of those continua, the termini of them. But then the thought is you can't call any of those termini the beginning of the change, because of course the far left side termini is the last moment at which the thing is at rest. It's not changing yet, so it hasn't gotten any changing done. Now, the reason why homogeneity is so important to Aristotle is because homogeneity is a crucial element in a long tradition of argument having to do with Zeno and Parmenides, whereby if you want to show that something is infinitely divisible, which Parmenides and Zeno wanted to do in order to bring out an absurdity, but Aristotle wants to invite because he thinks it poses no absurdity for him, is show that something is both divisible and continuous. Or sorry, both divisible and homogeneous. And once you've shown those two things, then you have shown that it is infinitely divisible on the grounds that homogeneity means that there would be no way to privilege any cut that you'd make in it over any other, right? And so if you can in principle divide something, but you can't privilege any place to cut it, and you can cut it anywhere, then Parmenides thinks you can cut it everywhere, right? And that's what makes it infinitely divisible. So I think that that's what the homogeneity thing is doing there. Does that clarify things?
Yeah. How does it get into like a how does it get from that to Aristotle saying that it's sort of like primitive in that it's like it's a unit of changing?
Oh, so I mean, the way I was using the word primitive is that it's almost what you might think of as a kind of metalogical argument on Aristotle's part. That is, he wants to say that the changing thing is primitive because the changing thing, that is, it's primitively divisible or primitively infinite in this sense, because the demonstration used to show that it's divisible or infinite doesn't appeal to the divisibility or infinity of anything else. And as I said, it's not clear to me that he's at all successful on that score with regard to infinity, though he does seem to have a way to do it with regard to divisibility. And I'm not sure what that means for the quality of the overall argument. But the primitiveness that I was trying to allude to was that I don't know quite how to describe this. Is metalogical an intelligible way to put it? The thought is he's got an argument, and it's the features of the argument that show the primitiveness of the changing thing. As opposed to the features by which he would show the other aspects are divisible.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I think that maybe I'm not asking it right, or I'm getting hung up on something, but it seems like he makes a move from something being infinite to something being one there. That, yeah, so thanks. This was great, so thank you.
Thank you.
Cameron?
Hi, Cameron.
Hey, Arnold. Really, really good to see you.
Yeah, it's good to see you. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. Thank you for this really, really interesting talk. This stuff also just totally fries my brain, so I really appreciate your help with it. So I think this is mostly just a question of clarification. So the question that Aristotle is dealing with here is about why all of these different aspects of nature are continuous, and you want to say that Aristotle's answer to that question is that fundamentally the continuity of the changing thing is where all of the other continuity is built upon, right? So that's the sort of the ground of all of the continuity of the rest of these different aspects of change. So I guess if that's right, then I want to go back to the slide with the white and blue block, maybe.
Yeah.
Can we look at that again?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is confusing me, and it seems to have to do with this weird claim about change propagating through the thing. Yeah. So it seems like Aristotle is then committed to saying that it's actually the spatial continuity that is the magnitude of the changing thing that grounds all these other kinds of continuity.
Yeah.
And so this weird claim about the change propagating through the thing turns out to be, I think, really, really important and fundamental to the whole argument about continuity. So I want to just ask for a little bit more explanation about this, because you could imagine, I think, really easily, like a situation in which it doesn't just happen, as it were, from left to right, but like a bone is sitting out in the sun and seems to be blanching or whitening, becoming pale all over, all at the same time. That is, it doesn't seem to be going from here to here. So I just want to ask for some clarification about this claim about propagating change through the body, how we're supposed to understand that, because I guess it seems to me to be sort of the crux on which all of these other kinds of continuity are hanging.
Yeah, so I think that this point, this is the point that has made, that is, assuming I'm right about it, has made these chapters so hard to understand. And the reason why is that this strikes us as a theoretically convoluted, empirically implausible thesis. And it appears to be undefended by Aristotle. And the reason why I think it's undefended is because, Owen mentioned a paper that I have in Ancient Philosophy where I basically try to argue that Aristotle changed his mind about something such that we get this theory. But one thing that I think Aristotle was always consistent on, that is something that he never even considered an alternative to, was that any continuous change propagates through the body of a changing thing. It never occurred to him that there was another possibility. And I think, and so the question is, why not? That is, why would that seem so obvious to us and not seem obvious to Aristotle? Where for Aristotle, the idea that something would change in all of its parts at once entailed that it would change instantaneously. That's the only way that could happen. Something couldn't change continuously in all of its parts at once. And I think the reason why we are ready to accept a continuous change, so Kant does this. Kant just accepts that you can have continuous changes through what you might call a constructed or pseudo-continuum of states, right? That is, Kant grants that there's no extensive magnitude of states through which something changes, but there's a continuum constructed out of a bunch of intensive magnitudes, like temperatures or shades or something. And so really the idea that something is changing through a continuum of states is the idea that we can construct a magnitude, that is a continuous magnitude, from a series of states. And that's the thing I think Aristotle never even considered, or that there's no evidence in the text, as far as I can see, that he considered that or took that seriously as a way for things to change. And so if I'm right about that, the question is why? And I think that the answer is that in order to be comfortable with making that kind of a claim, you more or less have to be comfortable with the real analysis of the continuum, right? So if we take a series of colors, for example, through which something changes, let's take the bleaching example, right? So something goes from being dark to being light through a dense series of shades. And the question is there a continuum of shades that are isomorphic with the time of the change? And I don't think Aristotle can say yes. And the reason he can't say yes is because each shade corresponds to an instant of time, even if they're densely ordered. And you cannot construct a continuum for Aristotle out of indivisibles, which each shade would be. It would be an indivisible, right? The only way to construct a continuum is out of other continua. And there is nothing in shades that is a continuum, right? Unless we assume we can construct them out of these non-continuous or non-divisible individual shades. And so that's why I think Aristotle would have been quite happy at one point in his career to say that the thing could bleach out in the sun and continuously go from one shade to another in all of its parts at once. But I think the way he would have actually analyzed that is that he would have said that that's a series of instantaneous changes. But it cannot be a continuous change. That is, it's many changes happening at various instants, but I don't think you can get a continuous change out of that for Aristotle, just on the grounds that you cannot construct continua. These pseudo-continua that Kant wants to put together out of intensive magnitudes, for Aristotle, that's just not what a continuum is. You can't put it together out of indivisibles. I don't know why Kant thinks he can do it either, because Kant doesn't have Dedekind. Kant apparently takes dense order for continuity. I think his critique argument works, but I think his inaugural dissertation argument is just wrong on the math. I mean, I think he just doesn't understand that point about continua. But then again, he's Kant, so. So then we get to this thought that all changes happen by propagating through a body. I sympathize. It really does seem like things can change all at once, and then there are changes where it's really hard to see how that is even possible, like a locomotion, right? If I'm going from Chicago to Philadelphia, there's no time in which I'm partly in Chicago and partly in Philadelphia. And so you have to, there's a chapter in my dissertation on this, how you work this out in each different kind of change. But something I try to argue for is that if you take Aristotle seriously, that there's a first result in every change. In a locomotion, that's the next U-sized space that you move into. That in any change of color, there can only be a finite set of colors through which you change. And then, of course, changes between contradictories like being and non-being. There's always just the first result. If you take that seriously, then Aristotle's view is not only intelligible, it's actually correct empirically. That is, not for reasons I think that he would have appreciated, but as a matter of empirical fact, bodies don't ever change all at once. Nothing ever happens that way. Changes always propagate. And it's just how you understand that propagation. So in the case of a generation, it's like first you get a heart, then a spine, then a brain, then the other parts start to come out, but it's part by part. It doesn't happen all at once. And then when you've got the whole body, then it starts to grow, and that looks more, you've got the complete thing there. But as you're filling out all the parts, that's a part by part change that propagates in some sense through the body of the changing thing. I hope that helps. This is definitely the hardest to sell bit of Aristotle's story. And the trouble, of course, is that I struggled against it for many years, but it's well attested in the text as far as I can tell, and I can't escape it. So I just decided to give in and accept it.
Yeah, no, it's really, really helpful, Arnold. Thank you so much. And thank you again for the presentation. Really, really great.
And thanks for the question.
Yeah, and thank you, Arnold, for the really interesting presentation too. So this is off the wall, and I'm not sure where it's going. I was originally going to ask another question, but Cameron's question is really the central one in trying to figure this stuff out. So I've been thinking as follows. If you look at your slide and you're wondering why can't the left-hand part of the block and the right-hand part of the block be changing together, we're already presuming that there is a left-hand side and that there is a right-hand side. We've already made a distinction between two parts of a whole.
Yeah.
So, but of course, for Aristotle, magnitudes are divided only if the potentiality to be divided is actualized. The very fact that the block is a whole means that there are not two parts until somebody does something, or something else does something to that body. Aristotle is not assembling the magnitude of the block on the basis of smaller pieces. That gives us Zeno's paradoxes, and he wants to work against that. So ontologically, the block is a whole. So if I'm talking about two parts of the block, The only context in which I will be talking about them will be if I am breaking it up with an axe or a knife, which is not what I'm doing, or there is some other kind of actualization going on. Well, what kind of actualization are we talking about here? We're talking about the motion from white to blue. So could it be that these parts that we're talking about are, their status is as divisions in the block in this particular context of the change? That is the blue acting on the white and propagating this change from white to blue somehow. There's really no other reason ontologically why there would be the need to distinguish as real ontological features the two sides of the block. So maybe part of Aristotle's solution has to do with that. The only reason why I'm talking about parts changing is because I need to distinguish between, he doesn't use these words, but would be the actuality and the potentiality in the changing thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just absolutely right. When Aristotle is talking about the changing thing, he doesn't use terms like substance, substratum, or body. He just talks about as just, you know, what undergoes the change, just with the participle in the article. I think he very much intends the kind of to be relative to the change, right? So if I'm, as it were, dipping that block into blue paint and it's just getting bluer and bluer as it goes on, those are the parts of the change that are identified with the changes, the parts of the, the parts of the changing thing that are identified with the parts of the change. But if I'm generating, that is, if I'm, you know, undergoing fetal development, then my heart is that first part and my spine is the second part and all of that stuff, where I very much am not like 3D printed from one end to the other, right? And so the parts are very much change relative. And the thing that I like about this thesis is that it, for me, explains in a way that feels deep, right? It feels like I'm really getting a hold of something. What I think is Aristotle's thought that matter is relative to change. That when we talk about the matter of something, some result, right, be it of a generation or analogically of other kinds of changes, it's relative to that particular kind of change. And the reason it's relative is because depending on the kind of change you're undergoing, the divisibility of your parts is going to be different, right? And so in metaphysics, where he says twice that the celestial bodies have matter for locomotion, but not for generation, that would make a whole lot of sense on this account, right? Because here, what matter for generation means is the kinds of parts that would allow you to be produced in order. Whereas matter for locomotion would just be something like the kinds of like spatial dimensionality that would allow you to pass into another space. And so I think that that's absolutely right, that we really have to relativize the kind of parts understood here to being discussed.
Right, and so the diagram is a little misleading because we already have a line cut down through it. You already have a spatial extension where we can hold our ruler up to it, as it were. And so, good.
Yeah.
Unless someone has another hand up, my second question is this: this business, the distinction between the changing and the change is really intriguing. The change has a linear order, the changing does not. And that reminds me of a distinction that is probably in the back of your mind, but you didn't bring it up in the paper, probably because it's not in Physics Book 6 to my memory. And that's between a kinesis, a change, and an entelechia, an actuality. And so Aristotle notoriously says that the test for an entelechia is, well, as soon as you've been doing something, you have done it.
Yeah.
But a kinesis isn't like that.
Yeah.
So to use Ackrell's notorious example, listening is an entelechia because, or hearing is an entelechia because as soon as I am hearing, I have heard. But hearing a symphony is not, because it's not the case that at any moment when I'm hearing Beethoven's Fifth, I've heard Beethoven's Fifth. So that would suggest that there is a linearity to kinesis that there is not in an entelechia, because an entelechia is a kind of a whole. And of course, a lot of people have racked their brains trying to figure out what exactly this distinction amounts to. Is it just a mode of speaking, or is there a real ontological difference here?
Yeah.
So I'm not going to ask you to solve that problem now, but how would you relate the distinction between the change and the changing to the distinction between a kinesis and an entelechia there?
So I've thought a lot about this because, as you can imagine, this it's a very suggestive pairing. And I don't think I've gotten to the bottom of it, but so here's what I think I can say. A change is a necessarily temporally extended thing. There are no instantaneous changes, and there is no such thing as the beginning of a change, right? And so what you can have is the last moment at which a thing is at rest. But anytime you identify a change, it's got to be between the thing that happens between that moment and whatever terminal moment you pick, right? The changing is also necessarily extended in time. It also does not have, there's no first moment at which something is changing. Again, I don't want to attribute any kind of conception of open intervals to Aristotle, but there's also no last moment at which a thing is changing, right? That's when it has changed. And so the changing is really, it's, I think you'd have to go to physics 3 and start talking about the idea of matter as the meat between two limits, the stuff between, where you start talking about that to get the right kind of conception. And then entelechia is distinct from both of these in that an entelechia also has no linear order, right? But it can be real, as it were. It can be fully realized in an instant. And so there can be a first instant in which I am listening and have listened, right? And so it really can have a beginning. You can begin to, and I think that this is, seeing these as really distinct is really, really important for Aristotle's conception of change, because the contact between, the only reason why the idea that there's no such thing as the beginning of a change isn't just a fatal paradox, is that the changes begin when there is a contact made between the agent and the patient. And the agent's activity on the patient is not a change. It's an entelechia, which means that it can have a first moment, right? It can be the inception. But the change itself cannot have a first moment. There can be nothing that, as it were, is the left boundary line of the change.
So the patiency is going to be something different from the changing. Because
I actually think that the patiency isn't. I think that the patiency and the changing, like if you wanted to give a theory about what changing is for Aristotle, I think it is the patiency qua patiency of the changing thing. That is, I think that that's what he's defining when he defines change in physics 3. Is he's defining the changing of the changing thing. And there he doesn't make any distinction between change and changing, and he just flips back and forth. But I think, my fault paper argues that this stuff in physics 6 is relatively late. And I think if he were to go back and sort it out, he would want to say he's explaining changing there in particular.
Excellent. Are there more questions? We have 5 minutes scheduled.
I've got a question. Maybe it's a suggestion or part of a suggestion on that last point. I think it's quite interesting, and it's a thorny problem that Aristotle, of course, defines change in physics 3 as an entelechia. So the question, of course, as he raised, is what is he doing there? And I think you're right to say that what Aristotle's describing is a description of changing, or what you're calling changing.
Yeah.
And so that seems on target. But there's another aspect that I think might be helpful here, and one of the reasons perhaps why, as you noted, Aristotle doesn't bring up things like potency and actuality in physics 6. And that is that in physics 6, Aristotle is talking about a certain aspect of change, and that is its categorical aspect. So when we're talking about the specific features of a change at some point, or at whatever point you wish to choose, then those specific features are, you have to be able to give a system of description to have a scientifically reliable account of change. But that is, giving a categorical description is different than describing, it's different than defining what change is. And in physics 3, Aristotle is very, very careful to distinguish the way of speaking about change in terms of the features of an object and the way of speaking of change as a definition. And the definition is the way, the definition of change is entirely formulated using dunamis and energeia and entelecheia. So I guess my suggestion is something like, when you're picking out the what I think is a well-observed distinction there, I think that we have to be aware of which register we're talking about. And as long as we can make the distinction between that categorical sense and that dynamic, energetic, entelecheia sense, then I think that we can start to reconcile we can start to deal with some of the problems we're talking about. So
yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
No, I think that that's absolutely right, and I didn't want to suggest that there was anything like a replacement of or an overlap in topic, really, even between the definition of change and what he's going on here. I mean, in physics 6, like there's definitely a lot of focus on the paradoxes of Zeno, and on the question of structure is really the central feature of it, which you wouldn't even expect in a definition, right? Questions of like the topological structure of change or something like that. So I think you're definitely right that those should be held apart. The thing that confuses me on this, and I really mean that in the most sincere way, I'm deeply confused about this particular question, is that I think one would want to say something like this, not just when talking about the definition of change in relation to physics 6, but also about the stuff that comes in physics 8, right? Where he's talking about the prime mover, and especially 8.8, where he starts talking about how a change could be continuous in the sense of infinitely extensive, go on forever. And the problem is that I don't see, I mean, and I've struggled with this for years. It's very hard for me to see how the stuff that he says in physics 6 in these chapters is terribly consistent with the stuff that he says in these other places. Like the idea that every changing thing has undergone an infinite number of changes, has changed infinitely many times. It's just remarkable to hear Aristotle say that, when in 8.8, of course, he says, absolutely not. You undergo one change and the rest are potential. Like you'd have to interrupt it to find them. Whereas here, there's no mention of any of that stuff. And so the idea of different registers or different voices is at once, I think, got to be the solution to this problem down the line. But at the same time, it's like, they should fit together. I mean, we should, yeah. We shouldn't be getting different claims out of those. And I sort of still don't know how to deal with that. But I take your suggestion that I think that's absolutely the way to go. I just don't know how to do it.
Yeah, and I think that I'm glad to hear that. And I think that actually, I mean, you were making implicitly you were making an argument for something like that position when you raised Kant's account of the sort of continuous activity of causality or something like that, the continuous appearance of a cause. And I mean, you use the word activity, or yeah. So I think that that sort of level of analysis already shows up in your presentation, and so I think that I mean, it shows up elsewhere in the corpus too, and it would be a really interesting project to collect those moments and try to figure out how they fit together. But I mean, it's like a shift from that sort of linear, sequential, horizontal analysis that you were talking about to a sort of a vertical analysis where you have an end in the sense of like a temporal end of a sequence, but then in a different way you have like the source of a change, which is present all the way through.
Yeah, the sort of logical metaphysical versus mathematical analysis or something like that. Yeah. No, thank you. It gives me a lot to think about. I think you're muted.
Let's all thank Arnold for a really interesting talk. Best of luck on the project. I'll be keeping my eye on it.
Thank you.
I thank you all, everybody, including Marquette folks and guests who came today. If you are not on our mailing list for such events and would like to be part of it, do shoot me an email. I'll get you on the mailing list. Once again, best wishes and good luck for a good semester for everybody. Stay safe. And thank you, Arnold, once again.
Thank you for having me in.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.